Hi, Rich.
Hello, Nathan.
It's a pleasure to be talking with you finally.
Yeah, this is terrific.
Yeah, your writings have lately burst into my life through a couple of really insightful essays on the immanent frame, where I'm an editor, and then also a wonderful piece on killing the Buddha about the 30th anniversary of Archbishop Romero's death.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I'm glad to finally connect up with you as well because I've enjoyed your work on a number of sites, Killing the Buddha, The Immanent Frame, Religion Dispatches, The Guardian. So it's great to finally talk about some shared interests.
Well, thank you. Now you're out there in Zurich, and I'm here in California temporarily. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing there and what you're doing generally?
Yeah, sure. I am Associate Professor of Ethics at the Claremont School of Theology in California and would otherwise be in California, but am currently at the University of Zurich on sabbatical in Switzerland, where it's a bit cool and rainy right at the moment. But am encouraged to know that there's some sort of a cultural event coming up on Monday where they set fire to a snowman to mark the end of the winter, and I'm kind of looking forward to that.
So there are still snowmen there.
Well, there's no snow on the ground now, but people keep saying it's not over yet.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Well, I just got to California from New York, and it was about 20 degrees colder. I want my money back. But anyway, let's start talking about what we're here to talk about. I was struck especially by your piece on Romero and grateful for it because you're about the only person talking about the Catholic Church right now who's not talking about Ratzinger, Benedict, and sex abuse. What drew your attention to this, and what made you decide to write about Romero at this time?
Sure. Yeah, well, I think the two issues, interestingly, do have some parallels, although they're, in fact, quite distinct, and I would hope that by talking about the one, we're not detracting from the importance of the other. I think that it's important to keep an eye on both of these issues. But the piece that I wrote for Killing the Buddha on the 30th anniversary of Romero's assassination.
And Romero is remind us again who Romero is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Oscar Romero was Archbishop of San Salvador in El Salvador, a Central American nation, and was assassinated 30 years ago this past March 24th while saying Mass in the chapel of a small cancer hospital where he worked. The day before, he had given a sermon at the Basilica at which he called upon the government, the National Guard, and the soldiers in the armed forces to stop repressing the Salvadoran people. This was at a time when El Salvador was sliding toward civil war. In fact, the assassination of Romero is considered by many historians to sort of mark the beginning of a civil war that sadly went on for another 12 years after that. And Romero is important because he was Archbishop for just 3 years. Many people believe that he was asked to serve in that capacity because he wasn't a particularly politicized priest or bishop. But just a couple weeks after he was installed as Archbishop, a friend of his, Father Rutilio Grande, who was a Jesuit priest, was assassinated along with an elderly man and a young boy. And this event touched off a concern on Romero's part for the human rights of Salvadoran people and concern for sort of the least advantaged members of Salvadoran society. This at a time when the church in El Salvador, by and large, had a history of aligning itself with the elite, with the ruling classes. And so to take the side of the poor was a fairly radical move, which didn't sit well with people who benefited from unjust social arrangements in that country. Didn't sit well with the government of the United States either, which was supporting the Salvadoran government at the time. And this was a very repressive government. So it was in some ways not surprising that Romero was targeted. He knew that he was a targeted person, but he refused bodyguards. He said, "I'd rather share the lot of the people that I serve." And he was assassinated for his work on behalf of human rights. What's particularly striking is that the responsibility for the assassination fell. It was determined some years later in 1993, after the very end of the Civil War, when the UN sponsored a Truth Commission in El Salvador. And that Truth Commission named Roberto Dobison, who was a retired Army major in El Salvador, as the mastermind behind this killing. And Dobison, interestingly enough, was also the founder of the Arena Party, which is one of the major political parties in El Salvador, which just until last year had held the presidency for some 20 years. A very conservative party. But just this past year, for the very first time, a president was elected from the FMLN, which was the party that had emerged out of the guerrilla movement that opposed the military during the Civil War. And so the new president, Mauricio Funes, is sort of ushering in a new vision for the country right now.
And so how, I know that as head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Cardinal Ratzinger, now Pope Benedict, was involved in suppressing the liberation theology movement in Latin America. How connected was he with Archbishop Romero's work? How connected are those two issues?
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, current Pope Benedict XVI, before he took that name, was Cardinal Ratzinger. And Ratzinger served as the head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, which is, among other things, the organization within the Catholic Church that has been investigating the child abuse on the part of priests. But it also is concerned with maintaining kind of doctrinal standards and orthodoxy in the Church. And Ratzinger was actually, as you say, very critical of what came to be called liberation theology. Liberation theology is a movement that sees the role of the Church and, in fact, God's role as decidedly on the side of the poor and oppressed, and not on the side of the elite. Historically, the Vatican has been somewhat wary of liberation theology, and has actually in recent years come down on one of Romero's theological advisors and friends, Father Sobrino, who is a Jesuit who teaches in San Salvador at the Central American University there, and was a close friend of Romero's. But recently that Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith that Ratzinger had once headed issued a notification on Sobrino's theology, kind of questioning some of the orthodoxy of Sobrino's theology. So there are some kind of interesting connections here. But I think the central issue that sort of maybe connects these two stories is that both of them involve the question of how powerful social institutions, whether political or religious, respond to the most vulnerable people in their care. Mm-hmm. And there's a terrific painting that is in the Oscar Romero Center at the University of Central America in San Salvador, which is a Jesuit-run university. And it shows Romero's lifeless body after he's been assassinated. And there's a woman sort of kneeling beside the body who represents the poor. There's a soldier kind of looking sorrowfully at the fallen Romero. There's a child, a naked child, the child of the poor, kind of on the floor. And then there's a priest or a bishop who's standing there with his hand resting on Romero's chest. But he's not looking at Romero. He's looking behind him at a kind of stylized crucifix on the wall, and doesn't seem to notice the lifeless body there in front of him. Or that his foot is resting on this child of the poor. So I think it attests to the fact that there was a struggle within Romero's own church on precisely what its role should be vis-a-vis the most vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And liberation theology was an attempt to articulate, in a sense, a kind of radical human rights doctrine that would, and a Christianity that would put the poor at the center.
That's exactly right. Yeah, to kind of to make the experience of the poor the context out of which theology would arise, rather than trying to do theology from the top down.
Yeah, and you've been looking at contemporary human rights discourses as well, which could be phrased as a way of hopefully will be phrased as a way of putting the concerns of the poor and the oppressed first. But it's a very different kind. I mean, it's almost more Roman. It's a more legalistic approach to curing the concerns of the disenfranchised and of protecting people. And it's also framed religion in a very different way.
Yeah, that's right.
It's distinctly anti-revolutionary in the way that liberation theology wanted to be revolutionary.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, let me preface what I'm about to say with a distinction. I've been writing about a series of interreligious declarations of human rights, four of these declarations of human rights that have been developed over the past 15 years or so. And I'm rather critical of these declarations, but the important distinction I want to make here is between the intentions of the people who created these documents, the signatories and the drafters on the one hand, and what I see as the rhetorical effects of these projects on the other. And my criticisms are entirely about the latter. I mean, I am more than happy to grant that these are well-intentioned documents, and I share the basic concerns, I think, of the folks who have been involved in these projects. And so my criticisms are not of their goals, but of the language that's used in these declarations, because my argument is that what these declarations do is different from what they purport to do. They purport to give the idea of human rights religious support, but in fact, I argue that what they do is to construct a category called religion. In other words, to define religion in such a way as to make it compatible with human rights and place the potential for violence outside of what we're going to count as true religion. And I see this happening in the declarations by means of three basic distinctions. One is the distinction between religion and secularity. Another is the distinction between the so-called world religions and various lesser traditions, as it were. And then a third is the distinction between genuine religion or true religion on the one hand, and then the sort of political manipulation of religion on the other. And the net effect, I argue, of treating the topic in this way and sort of making these rhetorical distinctions is that what we're left with is a conception of religion which, as you say, is depoliticized. It's a conception of religion such that religion is basically inward, personal, disconnected from political struggle. Certainly there's a kind of ethical component to it, which for many of the declarations is framed in terms of the Golden Rule. But the political aspect of religion, I think, goes missing in this project.
Yeah, now how deep do you think that human rights discourses in religion goes? I mean, some people will say that human rights couldn't have existed without the Christian tradition or without some other tradition. You know, and others say that human rights is this distinctly secular creation, which religion may be able to support, may not be able to support, but that the two are somehow antithetical. So maybe the question is there a connection here? I mean, is it inevitable that a human rights discourse would protect religion because they share a genealogy?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that I mean, certainly in the last few years, there have been a number of influential writers who have argued that the concept of human rights is inherently a religious notion. Nicholas Walterstorff, for instance, on the Protestant side, Michael Perry on the Catholic side have both made this kind of an argument. And then there are people who, as you say, argue that on the contrary, the idea of human rights is purely secular. Louis Hinken makes this kind of an argument. I am uncomfortable, actually, with this whole distinction between what's religious and what's secular. But I think the important point to make is that, granted, on the one hand, human rights claims are universal. They make claims on every human being, and they make claims about every human being. So in that sense, they aspire to a kind of universal validity. On the other hand, of course, reasons are always reasons for particular groups of people, situated as they are in particular socio-historical contexts. And so it seems to me that if we're looking for a justification for the idea of human rights, our most promising avenue is not to look for a single argument that's going to be appealing to everyone, a kind of knockdown argument that will convince you of the importance of human rights, irrespective of where you stand. But instead, what we should look for is a series of arguments that will be convincing to various constituencies. Maybe no one of these arguments will be convincing to everyone, but what's important for the realization of human rights in practice is that there be enough arguments out there that enough people can rationally support the idea of human rights. So I don't think that human rights has to be conceived as inherently secular or inherently religious. Rather, I would argue for a variety of conceptual grounds for human rights. I mean, I think the other important point to make here, I mean, I've been sort of suggesting that there's nothing philosophically amiss with looking for a justification for universal claims within a sort of limited, particular, contextual situation. I mean, we do this all the time, and moral claims are just one example, but we do this in science and mathematics and history and so on. On the other hand, I think it's important to remember, too, that historically universal claims about human nature have been one of the primary guises in which various colonial projects have advanced themselves. And so we need to be really careful about claims that purport to be true universally. And, you know, I think one of the important ways that people can do that is by sort of imaginatively putting themselves in other people's shoes, or even better than that, actually engaging in dialogue with people who come from different vantage points, and that it's consequently important to listen to dissenting voices on the topic of human rights. We don't want to surround ourselves only with like-minded people who kind of think as we do, but to surround ourselves with a variety of points of view.
So what's at stake in the criticisms that you're making, again, of the effects and not the intentions of what people are doing?
Yeah. Well, I guess I'd say two things. One is that it's important to me that we don't prevent criticism of religious institutions. I mean, I think that one of the drawbacks of the language of some of these human rights declarations that I've been talking about is that they construct a category of religion which is sort of impervious to critique. It portrays religion as entirely benign or entirely positive, such that the possibility of religious violence is, you know, almost a contradiction in terms. You can have violence done in religion's name, as the phrase goes, but it's only nominally religious. It's not genuine religious violence, for instance. So I'm concerned about that kind of a move, and I want to hold open the possibility of serious critique of religion, not because I'm in any way opposed to religious institutions, but because I think this is actually important for religion itself, that there's a kind of normative dimension to religious discourse. And I mean, the example of Romero is a perfect example of this, where a lot of Romero's critique was directed against the institutions of his own church. I mean, he was a loyal Catholic to the very end, but that didn't prevent him from pointing out certain flaws in that tradition. So I think it's important to hang on to that dimension of religious discourse. And the other thing I would say is it's important to hang on to the idea, too, that religion and politics are intimately connected. I mean, there's a lot of talk these days about religion and politics, but I don't see these necessarily as two distinct spheres that have to be somehow related to each other. I mean, I think that religion and politics are much more intimately tied up together than that. And so I'm concerned about discourses about religion that have the effect of more or less depoliticizing religion, turning religions into consumer products, and consequently removing the possibility that they could actually launch a serious critique against the reigning political and economic structures of the day.
Yeah. Well, the language that when you talk about in the name of religion, violence in the name of religion, which is used so much, particularly when talking about violence. This is not Islamic terrorism, or this is not Christian terrorism. This is terrorism in the name of, and then that enables leaders in these traditions to, in effect, make strong statements against this violence, which ostensibly is something we would like to be able to do. We'd like Christian leaders to get up and say, murdering abortion doctors is not Christian, or flying planes into buildings is not Muslim. How then could religious authorities speak against these atrocities in religious terms?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's great. A good question. I mean, I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that religion isn't a purely descriptive category. It's a normative category. It's a status that we grant to certain kinds of movements, or alternatively, I mean, sometimes the term functions pejoratively, right? To say that so-and-so is motivated by religion. I mean, this, for instance, one of the interesting things to me is how the language of religion has shifted over the years. And I mean, I think a good example of this is to look at how the term religion functioned in 19th century Orientalism. Orientalism, of course, was a intellectual movement, a movement in European scholarship in the 19th and early 20th centuries, which the effects of which are still with us today, that was tied up with the construction of an identity for Europeans as the West that came about by contrasting the West kind of invidiously with the Orient, with the East. And so the Orient, the East, was portrayed as inherently sort of backward and timeless and feminine and religious, whereas the West was portrayed as masculine and progressive and rational and secular. So in that kind of discourse, religion was kind of a term of abuse. It was a way of otherizing the East and kind of suggesting that there was something backward about the people who the Europeans were at that time colonizing. So Orientalist scholarship, of course, was very tied up with a certain kind of European colonial politics and served to kind of legitimate that endeavor. That's very different, I think, from the way that the term religion functions in some of the contexts that you've just described there. I mean, one way of trying to understand the differences, I think, is that to think about our own identity as Americans, let's say. The United States is ostensibly a kind of secular democracy, but arguably the concept of America is that of a religious nation. I mean, there have been various sort of developments along the way in terms of how people have thought about American identity. But historically, this has been very much tied up with religion and how people have thought about what sort of the legitimate religious options are. So, of course, once upon a time, there was kind of a conception of America as a Christian nation. But I argue that around the middle of the 20th century and kind of the post-war period, a new sort of more pluralistic or quasi-pluralistic way of thinking about America emerged, which is captured nicely, I think, in the phrase Judeo-Christian, which became popular right around that same time. And the idea was that we're not simply a Protestant nation, but we are a religious nation. And of course, this was tied up with the fact that we were entering into a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And so there was this sort of Cold War rhetoric of the Soviet Union as the godless communists and America as a religious nation. So it came to be important to think of ourselves not simply as Christian or even Judeo-Christian, but eventually as religious, which is not to say that the sort of Christian nation stuff has fallen away. On the contrary, that's obviously a powerful force today, although it means something a little different today than it did, I think, prior to the mid-20th century, and we could talk about that more maybe as well. But in any case, it's now, as you say, become important to our self-identity as a religious nation that any kind of violence that seems to be associated with religion be put outside the boundaries of true religion. And so we want to suggest that, terrorism, for instance, is not true religion, or that Christian militias or people who kill abortion doctors are merely acting in the name of religion and not embodying true religion. And as you say, I mean, there's a certain sense in which there's a kind of theological point to that if you want to debate about what constitutes true Christianity or true Islam. There's nothing at all wrong with that. But it's important, I think, in all of these contexts to realize that there are normative claims being advanced. And consequently, whenever we hear the word religion, I think we need to sort of prick up our ears because this is a loaded term. It's a term that embodies certain kinds of interests. So we can be certain that something big is at stake when people start talking about what true religion is.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you bring up the Oriental example of Orientalism, because now one of these big questions going on in the UN is the anti-blasphemy proposals led by Muslim countries. Right, and they're right. saying that no one should be allowed to criticize religion, and this goes against this Western value, so-called Western value of free speech, that virtually nothing is off limits to criticism. Yet in these cultures, they're saying, in these countries, they're saying, no, we don't operate that way. You're being Orientalist again by saying that that religion should be openly criticized.
Yeah, right. I mean, this, as you say, is an issue that's been coming up repeatedly over the last few years. There have been a series of resolutions that were adopted by the Human Rights Council against the defamation of religion, kind of suggesting that it is itself a violation of human rights to speak disrespectfully of people's religious commitments. Again, the issue is a complicated one. I mean, there's a lot of levels to take into account here. I mean, one is the question of who then gets to decide what counts as speaking ill of religion or blasphemy versus sort of cleaving to orthodoxy. I mean, one person's sort of conception of what constitutes orthodoxy is another person's heresy. And so there's a very real danger, I think, that if laws of this kind were taken seriously, it would be to the detriment of minority religious groups. But as you say, there are very different cultural norms and values kind of at play in these debates. And, part of the question, again, comes down to how we're going to sort of decide or define the norms of true religion or true Islam or true Christianity or whatever it might be here. I mean, I think this is an inherently sort of contested space, that there's no sort of view from outside, a scholarly position, as it were, that could tell us, as it were, objectively, well, what is true Christianity or what is true Islam or what is true religion, for that matter. These terms are names for particular sites of contestation, and the nature of the answers that are given get worked out politically to a large extent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And some of the people who are most eager to criticize religion today are the so-called new atheists, who for some reason we always have to say so-called before. I wonder when we'll just be able to say new atheists, or whether we'll just stop saying new atheists. I don't know. But they will insist that, no, this is not violence in the name of Islam. This is Islamic violence. This is religious violence. And then, in turn, within this Judeo-Christian religious country, they cry oppression, and they have statistics to point to this. I mean, according to the Penny Edgell study, these are the atheists are the people who most Americans are least likely to trust and
That's
least
right,
likely
yeah.
to elect as president. Yet at the same time, these are not necessarily the people that we think of first in terms of political oppression.
Right. Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, that's a very interesting study. It was conducted by Penny Edgell and some other researchers at the University of Minnesota. And what they did was they asked people which of the following groups, and they sort of gave people some choices, is furthest from my vision of America. And what they found was that in first place, the group that was farthest away from what most people understood by America was atheists. And this was actually followed somewhat distantly by Muslims, recent immigrants, and conservative Christians, and sexual minorities. So it was rather striking because, as you say, one wouldn't have thought that atheists were necessarily kind of a terribly oppressed group in this country, at least. I mean, historically, of course, atheism has been an oppressed position, and people there were fairly severe penalties for atheism in times past. Oppression, of course, is a kind of relative term. It's a heavy term. But I think what is fair to say is that, to some degree, declaring oneself an atheist puts one at a disadvantage, politically speaking, in this country.
Absolutely.
And I mean, there are sort of lots of anecdotes to the effect that it's more or less impossible to get elected if you are an uncloseted atheist. I mean, no doubt lots of people do get elected, but they do that by sort of, saying God bless America and towing the sort of civil religious line here. So I think there are some ways in which there is a definite kind of social exclusion of atheists in the United States, and that's probably part of why the new atheism, or the so-called new atheism, is important to pay attention to, because although a lot of the debate gets kind of carried out on a quasi academic intellectual level, part of what's at stake here is a certain political question about the inclusion of atheists in the conception of what counts as America. And I think this question of sort of American identity is one that won't go away. I know that there are lots of people who wish that we didn't sort of always have to be deciding who's in and who's out. And I'm highly sympathetic with that kind of view. But the truth is that at the heart of democracy, there's a kind of paradox, because on the one hand, in order to have a democracy, you have to have a demos, a people. And constituting that demos of necessity requires exclusions. I mean, if you've ever kind of been involved in starting up a democratic organization of some kind, like a student group or a community organization, you know that one of the first questions that always comes up is, well, who's eligible to vote? Now, of course, that's not a question that you can answer by a show of hands, by taking a vote, because that would sort of presuppose some answer to the very thing that you're trying to figure out. So the upshot of this is that democracy sort of requires exclusions. It requires a distinction to be made between insiders and outsiders, citizens and people outside the body politic. But on the other hand, and this is the other really important point, there's no democratic way of answering that question. You can't take a vote on who can vote. You can't, there's no sort of way of deciding from within the framework of democracy itself how you're going to decide this question of insiders and outsiders, which means that the moral boundaries of the in-group are always kind of in question. There's a constant struggle, a kind of political struggle to contest any particular way of drawing those boundaries. And religion is one way that those boundaries have been drawn historically in the United States. Race is another. Actually, those two things are very closely connected, I would argue. We could talk more about that if we'd like. But I think one way of viewing the new atheism or the importance of this movement is precisely as yet another political struggle to sort of include an excluded group in the definition of nationhood and the definition of who this we is when we talk about we the people.
Well, there's something interesting about atheists. I think that's a little different from an ordinary excluded group, in a sense, because I think if you talk to a lot of religious people in this country, conservative religious people in particular, you'll hear talk about the rampant atheism in culture generally. They'll talk about Hollywood. They'll talk about the universities. I don't know what else. They'll just talk about ordinary life where there isn't constant reference to God or and so forth. So I think there's an assumption that atheism, that there's a quiet atheism from within. It's closer to home in a way. And what's interesting about the new atheists is that they're really trying to create, or seem to be creating, a kind of sectarianism in a way that has never happened before. I mean, I've been really interested in following atheist blogs and going to atheist events. Just the other day, I was at one where we were sitting around a table, and these guys were imagining that after Obama gets out of office, he'll finally reveal his true stripes as one of them. There's a community forming.
That's right.
That's insisting on calling itself atheist, and that's rather than just being this implicit part of society that is kind of quiet and a kind of white noise. Now they're saying, no, you have to treat us in a sense the way you've been treating religions. You have to give us freedom to organize and to self-identify. So it's not quite like a foreign invader, but a part of what we've always been, or a part of what some could argue we've always been or should be.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I taught for 4 years at a university in Georgia, and one of the things I was struck by there was that there was a student organization that formed during the time I was there called the Atheists, Agnostics, and Free Thinkers. And it was striking to me, having moved there from California at the time, that here was a kind of largish group of people organized around a common disbelief, which I think at the time anyway, I wouldn't have expected to find in California, where the attitude is much more kind of whatever, kind of this general tolerance. But I think that had to do with the fact that, in the Bible Belt, there's kind of a normative Christianity And so rebellion against that becomes a meaningful and in many ways sort of courageous choice. But I think the other part of what you're saying that's really fascinating and has been of interest to me as well is the way in which atheism has, at least in recent years, come to begin defining itself as a functional equivalent to religion. In other words, on the one hand, there's this sort of atheistic critique of religion as such, which is interesting in its own right because, historically it was belief in God or Christianity that atheism was defined in opposition to, whereas now it's defined largely in opposition to religion. I think there's a number of reasons why that's the case. But there's this sort of move on the other hand now within certain circles to kind of depict atheism as almost another kind of religious option that one could participate in. And so, when Mayor Bloomberg had his interfaith breakfast in New York in January, one of the groups there was an atheist organization. And it's striking that when Obama was inaugurated, he declared that the United States was a country of, and then he listed a number of sort of standard world religions, as it were, and then mentioned atheism as well. So I think that, this, another example of this that I've become very interested in is the headstones that are available through the Department of Veterans Affairs for veterans. And there are a number of possible symbols that a person could have inscribed on a government-issued headstone, and they're the sort of technical term that they use is emblems of belief. And there's some, 30-odd, maybe more emblems of belief that people can choose from amongst. And, this sort of came into the news a couple of years ago when a lawsuit was filed on behalf of some Wiccan groups because they had submitted a number of petitions over the course of 10 years or so asking for a Wiccan pentacle. And these petitions had never been acted on, and during that same period, a number of other groups had emblems of belief approved by the Department of Veterans Affairs. So it's very interesting to me, on the one hand, how, this is a perfect example of how the state is involved in maintaining the nation by deciding what counts as genuine religion, or by deciding what counts as sort of a permissible form of civil religion. On the other hand, it's also interesting that one of those emblems of belief that's been approved is an atheist's emblem, which actually sort of looks like an atom, like the shield of the Atomic Energy Agency or something like that. So it's kind of, on the one hand, this sort of scientific-looking symbol, but on the other hand, it's kind of on a par with and modeled on, a series of other sort of symbols associated with religious groups. So there's this definite push, I think, on the part of atheism to be included among those options that are considered acceptable features of national identity. And of course, that in turn kind of on the one hand involves sort of fashioning atheism in the identity of a religious movement. But what will then happen if atheism succeeds in achieving the same kind of inclusion that certain other religious groups have? That, I think, is a really fascinating question, because historically what we've understood by religion has always been constructed precisely over against atheism. So if atheism then can sort of be included among the religions, it'll no longer, I think, be entirely clear what the contrast case is. And in that case, it'll no longer be entirely clear if religion can anymore serve as this sort of underlying notion of sort of self-understanding of what being an American is all about, which could be very welcome, right, if it means a shift away from sort of religious identities as the marker of what it means to be a good American. On the other hand, I mean, there's also the very real possibility that it will lead to the reassertion of sectarian identities, right? America as a Christian nation is in some ways defined against America as a religious nation. And it's interesting, I think, that, the rhetoric of the new atheism, the sort of anti-religious aspect of it, is actually kind of not all that different from the rhetoric of conservative evangelicalism, which is also very much anti-religion. Doesn't understand itself to be one religious option amongst others, but the truth. Right,
which is interesting because both are taking these denominationalist forms, but they both deny that they're a part of a religious system, or that they're resembling religion.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I think there's some unclarity as to strategy here, and it's I think remains to be worked out exactly kind of what the eventual path that some of these groups will take, and it could well be that they will take multiple paths, that there won't be a single movement called the New Atheism, but that there will be kind of a proliferation of various options that could loosely be.
Yeah, there are more and more groups, and in New York, these groups are growing rapidly. I've noticed. I've been working with a writer for Killing the Buddha who's been studying them, and is just amazed at how quickly they're growing, how much energy there is, and whenever that happens, there are stakes, and there are politics, and there are splinters. It'll be interesting to see.
That's right. Yeah,
and I've been following as you saw in one of the essays I did for The Guardian was the recent interest among atheistic philosophers in theology, and in a sense crafting explicitly non-religious political movements in terms of religious thought that has gone before. For instance, Badiou and Zizek reading St. Paul.
Right.
And then Zizek also debating John Milbank, the Anglican theologian. There's an interest in looking to, and this is a different group than the New Atheists. These are European philosophers, but they're interested in looking to religious forms in order to inform a non-religious ethic. And it's an interesting way in which, again, these lines are being blurred between what's a religion, what's not, and it seems productive in a lot of ways. I mean, it seems like a step forward out of this mutual demonization that's been so pervasive.
Yeah, that's right, and it's interesting too that for instance in the Milbank and Zizek conversation, I mean that, as you say, is largely about sort of political readings of Christianity, and not about sort of this pseudoscientific question of evidence for the existence of God, for instance. So. Yeah, I agree with you that I think there's kind of a subtler, more sophisticated kind of discourse about atheism and religion, and about kind of what the differences come down to in the end.
Well, what do the differences come down to, do you think? I mean, in your experience, in your, what does the difference mean to you?
Yeah. Well, one thing I would say is that I think one issue that gets lost in the debate between Dawkins and the various intelligent design people that he often engages, they're both operating with a particular understanding of what God is and what would be required to warrant belief in God. And it's a very sort of foundationalist approach, which assumes that God is kind of an explanatory entity, which may or may not exist, and the question then becomes, do we have sufficient evidence to warrant belief in God? And of course, the evangelical philosophers say that we do, and that God is the best explanation for that evidence. And of course, the new atheists argue that actually the God hypothesis, as Dawkins puts it, is even more confusing than the data that's meant to explain, and so forth. I've argued in a number of places that actually that's a fairly modern reading of what belief in God comes down to. And I actually think that historically that's really not what Orthodox theology has ever claimed. I mean, I think one issue that Orthodox believers and atheists alike could, in theory, get behind on is precisely the proposition that in an inventory of the furniture of the universe, you won't find God among the things beginning with G. God just isn't an object or a thing in the universe that might or might not exist. So if that's the case, then I think this whole sort of approach, this whole debate is sort of missing the point in a way. But there are some interesting ways in which historically, it seems to me, the potential for atheism of this sort of quasi-scientific kind that Dawkins represents was actually put into motion by moves internal to theology itself, or at least internal to sort of religion. And in particular, one of these that I know that you've written really brilliantly about is the way that theistic arguments have kind of changed over the years. You have a terrific piece on this in The Guardian that I really enjoy. And I've written some about this as well. But I mean, one of the sort of interesting things to me is that theistic arguments nowadays are typically assumed to be freestanding proofs of God's existence. And so the question becomes, do they work? Do the arguments, are they convincing to atheists? And almost nobody, well, I shouldn't say that, but I don't think they work. And so the question then is, well, is that what the theistic proofs were sort of meant to be doing in the first place? And I think if you go back, say, 1,000 years to the time of Anselm or Al-Ghazali, what you discover is that no, this is not the use that theistic proofs ever had in the past. They always, in the past, were directed not against atheists, because, of course, atheism wasn't really a live option for very many people, but rather were directed toward other believers, often members of one's own religious community, and serve very different kinds of functions to kind of elucidate faith from within, to kind of give a grammatical description of faith, as it were, or kind of spell out the implications of the concept of God. But this was something that was always already done within the realm of belief itself. It wasn't kind of an attempt to ground a religious worldview from scratch, but was an effort undertaken within that worldview to kind of spell out its implications.
Right. It's I mean, the emotional content of the historical proof, some of them at least, some more than others. I mean, you mentioned Anselm, a Benedictine monk in the Middle Ages in northern France, who developed what's called the ontological argument. For him, when you read his account of this argument, it's so saturated with emotion. It's so saturated with feeling. He has this discovery while at choir in the morning one day, where it hits him, the light of God smacks him in the face, and and suddenly this theoretical proof comes into his head. So the
Right.
proof is indelibly attached to that emotional content, and when you compare the language in the proof with the language he's using to write to his beloved friends at faraway monasteries, the language is almost indistinguishable. And one person I've been who I just met with out here in California is Ray Comfort, who's an evangelist who's well known for getting on YouTube with a banana and saying that this is an atheist nightmare. And
I think I've heard of this. Yeah.
He's an interesting figure because he gets up and says, "I have scientific proof for the existence of God," and then he talks about his banana for about a minute, and then he gets up and convinces people that they are guilty before God, and that they're in need of repentance. He turns to the heart. He says this explicitly, that the proof, the scientific proof, is a hook, and the emotional content is what is going to draw people, is what's going to change people's lives. It's in a sense, hearing him to talk that way reminds me of Anselm. And Anselm was an incredibly sophisticated thinker, and I don't want to downplay that. But the way in which a lot of discussion about proofs now has detached them from this emotional content, has detached the logic from the feeling, I think has made us forget what was really being said when these ideas were being developed, and what's really powerful about them. And I think that there's something about this in a literary sense that can be valuable to theists, atheists, whatever. There's for instance, Iris Murdoch, who's a English philosopher and novelist, who is a non-theist in an Orthodox Christian sense, used Anselm's ontological proof as an argument for the good, for a non-religious, non-theistic morality in beautiful ways, in remarkable ways, and she does this because she's able to look at the proof in a more nuanced way than a lot of analytic philosophy has done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think the only thing I would want to add to that is just that the distinction between reason and the emotions isn't always so clear either, right? That the emotional aspect is not sort of a substitute for good arguments or good reasons, but that those reasons, again, have to themselves be sort of contextualized. And I mean, it's interesting that we always think of Anselm as the guy who invented the ontological argument, but I mean, that was a rather small piece of what he was about. And in fact, the phrase ontological argument wasn't invented until, I think, Kant. I think he's the one who came up with that particular phrase. So it's gotten to be customary that, in philosophy of religion textbooks, people sort of anthologize maybe at most 3 chapters from the proslogion. But of course that, as you say, takes the argument entirely out of its context, which is a context of contemplation and prayer and, kind of steeped in the language of the Psalms and all of this, which gets entirely lost when you treat it as if, this were some sort of freestanding logical proof that we could just sort of evaluate quite apart from all of that.
Yeah. Well, we should probably close this down. I feel like it could go on for a long time. But,
well, I've really enjoyed speaking with you. It's been terrific, and I hope we do it again.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rich.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan.